Reactions have been mixed to a climate deal struck following extended talks at COP29 over the weekend.
The EU and the US hailed the deal, while the UN's climate chief said it would keep the clean energy boom growing.
But developing and poorer countries most vulnerable to the climate crisis are up in arms, saying the $300 billion agreement was far from sufficient. The frustration prompted some developing and island nations to walk out of the meeting. India led the criticism, blasting the COP29 presidency and host Azerbaijan of betraying trust.
We had informed the Secretariat that we wanted to make a statement prior to any decision on the adoption. However, and this is for everyone to see, this has been stage managed, and we are extremely disappointed with this incident.
We accepted the text because we could not leave Baku without a text, but we're not satisfied whatsoever.
The climate finance agreement marks a boost of $200 billion from the previous deal, but developing nations wanted as much as $1.3 trillion. It lays bare the deep rift between developing countries reeling from the cost of storms and droughts to wealthy nations more preoccupied with domestic concerns and surging geopolitical tensions.
Now, the deal also failed to set out detailed steps for how countries are to act on last year's climate summit pledge to transit from fossil fuels and triple renewable energy this decade. For more on what COP29 achieved and did not, let's speak now with Paul Bledsoe, a professorial lecturer of the Center for Environmental Policy at the American University. He's also a former climate advisor to the Bill Clinton administration. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. Firstly, I just want to get your reaction to this new climate deal. Are you relieved that there has been some progress, and given, $300 billion is not peanuts? Or are you more concerned and disappointed, given it's still far short of what's actually needed to tackle a climate crisis?
It's both, right? $300 billion annually by 2035 is a huge sum of money. It's important to note that that would come from every source, both government funding, private sector funding, the World Bank, other development banks, from every single source. So they're adding up different sources. The problem is, of course, that climate change impacts are going to be costing trillions of dollars a year by that point. And so what I'm disappointed in is the lack of concrete emissions reductions from major countries, especially China, because that's the source of the problem. If we continue to allow emissions to grow, we are going to encounter unbelievably expensive and killing climate change impacts. Already, 10 years after the Paris Agreement was adopted, we have surpassed the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. We are nowhere near reducing emissions enough, particularly of methane, which is a super pollutant, 80 times more powerful than CO2. China held with the U.S. a summit on methane, and yet 3 years after promising a methane reduction plan has not come across with methane cuts. If we do not begin cutting methane and other emissions, the amount of money will never be enough to deal with the climate change impacts that are headed our way.
Well, Professor, I'm glad you brought that up because, first of all, there's, I guess, a bit of ill feeling because of the way COP29 was conducted. Developing nations felt betrayed, and they felt that they were railroaded into accepting a deal. But the other issue as well is the amount of money that's needed, for the change, that's been talked about. And the question I have is, we know that developing nations now accounted for, 75% of the growth in emissions over the past decade or so. So isn't more money the solution in terms of helping countries, maybe not so much China, but other developing countries, to reduce these emissions, which have been growing dramatically over the past few years?
Right. So developing country emissions have well surpassed. China's emissions alone are more than the developed world combined. And so we have to subsidize clean energy technologies for largely the global south, particularly economies like India have very fast growing emissions. But at the same time, we've got to focus on near-term temperature increases. Our biggest risk is climate change tipping points in natural systems. I'm talking about things like Arctic sea ice, which is rapidly disappearing, only half of the ice we had 50 years ago. I'm talking about the functioning Amazon forest, using the forest to reduce CO2 emissions rather than add to them. And there are dozens of other natural systems that are stressed to the point that they will become net warming contributors, not warming inhibitors. We are incredibly close to tremendously dangerous global conditions. And that means that all nations have to reduce their emissions as quickly as possible. And in particular, I'm deeply disappointed by the re-election of Donald Trump. I think it's a profound step back, particularly for how the United States is going to act on the world stage. That being said, I don't believe that the Congress is going to be able to overturn the domestic clean energy provisions that were passed into law under the Biden administration 2 years ago. They've proved very popular. They've spurred hundreds of billions of dollars a year of clean energy investments by the private sector in America. So we just need to double down on clean energy, methane cuts, and other emissions reductions that are the key to limiting near-term temperatures. Because if we allow tipping points in natural systems, no amount of money is going to be able to deal with the climate impacts that we're going to encounter.
So, Professor, is that where you expect the $300 billion commitment to be allocated? And when will it actually start flowing to developing countries? Because we know back in 2009, developed nations pledged $100 billion annually, but that target wasn't met until, 2022?
That's right. There's a huge disparity between these numbers that are picked out of thin air and the actual amount of money that is being invested. The good news is the price of clean energy has fallen by 90% in just the last decade. If we can make money-making investments that companies around the world can use and citizens can have energy that is cheaper and cleaner, that's a tipping point in the positive sense that we can begin to get away from fossil fuels. Just this year, it appears that Chinese emissions of CO2, the main greenhouse gas, have peaked. That means that global emissions may peak this year or next year. The problem is that there's a lag, and temperature is going to continue to increase for many years after even we reach a peak of emissions. So in particular, we've got to focus on methane and the other super pollutants, and we have to focus on limiting near-term temperatures to prevent natural systems from tipping into net warming contributors. If we can do that over the next 10 or 20 years with large amounts of money toward clean energy and climate impacts transition, we can prevent disaster. If we don't, we are still headed to really unfathomable global disasters. I'm talking about agriculture, water supply, desertification, forest health, heating of the oceans. These are really profound impacts that will hurt the world's poor the most. We have tremendous amount of work to do. This was just the very beginning of setting goals.
All right, Professor, we do have to leave it there. We thank you for your time and for your thoughts. Paul Bledsoe is professorial lecturer, Center for Environmental Policy at the American University and former Clinton White House climate advisor.